All right. Well, hello everyone. I know people are still filtering in, but it's 1:02 Eastern Time. We'll get started. First off, hi everyone. My name is Rob Catalano. It is nice to have you to our last WorkTango webinar series session of the year. To all of our community that have been with us for years, hello again. For newcomers, welcome. Welcome to this community and our last one of the year. My name is Rob Catalano. I'm the Chief Engagement Officer at WorkTango. I spend a lot of time, trying to support our HR community and bringing great speakers and topics to the mix along with the WorkTango team. And hopefully today will be no different in what we're trying to do. And I love the topic that we're bringing up today. If you know me, you know WorkTango. This is what we do. We try to measure employee sentiment. But as we think about moving into fiscal year 2022, our planning, rapid execution of our new people programs. I'm sure a lot of our workplaces are changing. New strategies on change management. We just felt it was really good timing for this session on measuring what matters, right? Understanding the science and craft of the human capital value chain. So before I introduce our speaker today, I always like to give a little bit of housekeeping. So a few things. One is this is meant to be an interactive chat. Again, if you're new to our series, this is a point where you can, if you have Q&A and questions, pop them in the Q&A. If you have any issues or need some help or just want to interact and give, virtual thumbs ups and anything you'd like to do to make it interactive, you can do that in the chat section. I will be the voice for all of you today. So if there are questions, I've been given permission to interrupt our speaker, try to dig into some specific things, and knowing the speaker, he's definitely okay with it and want to make it more of a conversation, as we know it's hard to do in these remote and virtual type events. But we do want to have everyone's full attention. Huge value for the hour that we have together, and excited to get started by introducing our speaker. So our speaker today is Mahesh Subramani. You got to tell everyone the story of Super Money later, but Mahesh is a PhD in industrial organizational psychology and a professor of management and the director of the Center of Human Capital and Leadership at Northern Illinois University. His research is shaped by practical problems faced by organizations such as talent retentions, D&I implementation, and the performance and well-being of frontline service workers. He's provided analytics consulting to several organizations. The list is very, very long. I'll let you read it on our site. And his research has been published in many reputed academic publications: Academy of Management, Journal of Academy of Management for Perspectives, Journal of Applied Psychology, HRM, and he seems to do it all. He's also the associate editor of the Journal of Service Management and the Journal of Business Research. Super impressive and excited to have you with us today. So before I hand it off to you, my last introduction is let everyone know something about you that you wouldn't find on your LinkedIn profile. And again, I'd love to share the story about Super Money with everyone. So the floor is yours, Mahesh.
Well, thank you very much, Rob. It's great to be here. So one thing that most folks don't know about me is that I have a pretty wicked Elvis impersonation. So I can actually do a pretty good Elvis. Especially in karaoke sort of contexts. So just kind of letting that out.
Will we be seeing that today, or is that
hopefully not?
Got it. Okay, great. Awesome. All right. Well, again, really appreciate you being here. I'll let you share your screen and dive into the session. But again, thanks for being here and excited for what's to come.
Totally. So what I'd like to do is to begin by telling all the audience here is keep the questions flowing. I really want to make this as useful and value added as possible to you. One of the reasons I do sessions of this sort is to bridge the gap between what we do in the ivory tower and what folks like you face on a day-to-day basis in the metaphorical trenches of human resources and operations. So one of the things I'd love to do is to sort of invoke somebody everybody knows, Peter F. Drucker. He sort of talked about how people are not really treated as a resource. This was this is almost 50 years ago, and you would think that things have changed remarkably over the last 50 years. But the more I have conversations with folks in companies, specifically in sort of non-HR roles, the more they seem to complain about how they would like to treat people as resources, but they just don't know what the science behind that is. They also know that it's important to measure, for the lack of a better term, people stuff, human experience, employee engagement, employee satisfaction. Those kinds of things are a little more easier to understand, but sort of thinking about how that connects to organizational or business value, that seems to be a big question that seems to be sort of unanswered even now. There's this old article by a guy called Keith Hammond in Fast Company from 2007, and I've seen this sort of making the rounds all over the place. But really what he talks about is that it's a very provocatively titled article. It sort of says that HR is a necessary evil. I mean, we don't like HR. Nobody likes HR. And the reason we don't like HR is because HR is supposed to add value. In fact, this is the function within the organization that has the highest capacity to do good. And yet, most HR functions are sort of lost in the paperwork, in the nitty-gritty, which is good, which is important. We need to sort of make sure that the trains are running on time, but we also need to figure out where the trains are going. So in other words, what are some ways in which the human resource function itself could be connected to the ultimate objective of the organization, which is really to create a competitive advantage. So what Keith Hammond talks about and what other folks have discussed with me over the last many years sort of makes me think about HR, or rather the expectations from HR as evolving over time. So if you think of the early 1920s or 1930s and 40s even, a lot of the focus of the human resource or personnel function in those days was really to keep employees happy and working. Right. So to make sure you bring those employees in, just make sure that they don't get into mischief, monitor them, and give them the carrot or stick as things might be. But over time, people began to sort of talk about HR not as just that one shop outside the executive suite, but sort of being part in some way of the organization strategy. But then the role really shifted more toward implementation of the business objectives. So many years ago, before I became an academician, I worked for a couple of Fortune 500 companies. And in both those companies, although the chief HR person was part of the C-suite, their role seemed to be more to implement business objectives. What that basically means is that the CEO, CFO, COO essentially come up with a strategy, and they sort of say, here's what we're going to do. We're going to expand. We're going to do a merger acquisition. And your role is to just find the right people to do so. And then the HR person essentially jumps up, salutes, and then goes out and does that job. And again, this might this might not be true of all corporations, but this was a very common pattern that I saw in the companies I used to work at as an HR person, mind you. But then over time, what I've noticed is that the discourse, both in academia as well as practice, has shifted to what can human resources do to drive competitive strategy. And this goes beyond just sort of this whole idea of business partnership. So it's good. It's a good idea for HR to be a business partner, but I want to sort of urge you to think beyond that. Is it possible for human resource to not just be a business partner, but to actually be one of the core creators of human capital value for the organization? And so what I'm going to be talking about in the next half an hour or so is really focused on the science of that idea. So this idea, in other words, seems to be quite radical to some folks, and for others, it might seem like a truism. But is there any science behind it, is the question. And so I'm going to sort of come at it from a science perspective. There's a second part to the story, and that's about the craft of the human capital value chain. So how do you sort of take these human capital value ideas and convert that into actual practice in your organization? Time permitting, I will try to get into that, but at least I'll try to give you a glimpse of it. So very, very quickly, and this is just my perspective that I need to share with you as we sort of begin, that I have a specific way of thinking about value. And I think of value not just in terms of the value that you create for shareholders. So I know that many of you are, in privately held companies. There are others who are who work for government or higher ed. But value creation for me is not just about creating more money for shareholders. It's really about meeting the sort of deepmost needs of various stakeholders. So that could be your partners, could be your suppliers, could be your customers, your employees, and even the planet in general. And so how does an organization go about creating that value? Well, essentially what the organization does is it takes a bunch of inputs: human resources, physical resources, financial resources. And then there's this magic that happens within the organization that converts that into value, right? And that creation of value essentially is what we are focusing on. So you're taking all these resources, and then you're extracting value from those resources. So you have talent, but talent is not talent until talent is harnessed. Talent otherwise is simply potential, right? So when somebody comes and works for you and you bring that person in who's, might have a PhD, an MBA, or whatever, that's all they have. What you have to do is to find the best way to harness their capacities and their motivation so that they can contribute their best to the organization. So when you think about value, it's really about extracting value from talent, but then also combining it with other resources. So you have to get the right people, you have to get them motivated, then you have to connect them to the right processes, you have to give them the right tools and technology. And when all that combination is perfect, that's when you start creating value in a sustained kind of a manner. So one of the questions that folks in my field have asked, strategic human resource management, by the way, in this field have asked is, so what gives a company or an organization of any sort competitive advantage? Well, what really gives an organization competitive advantage is the ability to really extract that value in an inimitable way. That is, do it in a way where nobody else can copy it. So very simply put, when you think of your organization, the question that you ought to be asking is, how do we create value? That's number one. And number two, how do we create value in a way that nobody else can do, that nobody else can copy? Is there a magic sauce or a secret sauce that we have that cannot be replicated easily? That is, other folks can borrow our processes, they can steal our techniques, they can take our competency model, apply that to their company. But really, underneath that, is there something that is distinctive, that is ours? And therein lies the mystery, right? There's the mystery. How do you go about identifying that piece and then measuring it? And then demonstrating the fact that if you do these kinds of things from a human capital perspective, this will translate into ultimate value for various stakeholders. That's the mystery that I wish to tackle in my own career. I've tried to do that as a practitioner and as an academic. And that is a little glimpse that I would like to provide you with in the next few slides. But before we continue, I'd like to stop for just 5 seconds and see if there are any questions already from the audience.
Yeah, Mahesh, nothing's come in from the team yet, but I appreciate the intro, and I'm super excited for what's to come based on what you just said.
All right, perfect. So, introducing the human capital value chain. So, what is the human capital value chain? If you think of all the different pieces that you are really focused on as an organization, the most important piece is the outcomes piece. So think of this chain starting right to left. So read from right to left. We are ultimately interested in organizational outcomes. So regardless of the kind of company you are, there are certain financial outcomes that you are interested in. So although your mission might not include profitability or making a profit, but you still do want to make money. There is this idea of fulfilling your specific mission. So I work in a public university, a state university in the United States, and our mission really is to serve the community, to serve the public, right? So that is a mission, that is an outcome. Social. So just trying to do good, if you are an organization that has a corporate social responsibility kind of a motive, or if you are a social entrepreneur, that falls into this bucket as well. So ultimately what we want are a bunch of outcomes. But to get to those outcomes, we need to make sure that our customers or end users are satisfied and engaged in some kind of a way. So we measure that using, customer satisfaction scales, and most of you probably have some aspect of customer satisfaction as part of your measurement strategy. Loyalty, customer loyalty, share of wallet, well-being of some sort. That's becoming something big as well. So we're not just thinking of, the kind of work we do and how much of money that we make off our customers, but also in terms of, do we actually make a difference in their lives, right? So we know, and the research is very clear, that if you do certain kinds of things from a customer perspective, those do translate into organizational outcomes. So those of you who are familiar with the University of Michigan studies many years ago, about 25, 30 years ago, there was this whole benchmark that was created. It's called the ASCII. And the ASCII benchmark essentially tracks 100 companies across different industries. And what it essentially does is it looks at what is the customer satisfaction level of those 100 companies across those different industries. And it's tracked over time. And you can use that as a benchmark for your own customer satisfaction data. But it's also a way for you to see what is happening in general with the public. Are certain industries really becoming more positively perceived versus negatively perceived? So that research essentially shows us very clear connections between customer satisfaction, loyalty, and financial outcomes like return on assets, market share, and things of that nature. But our interest is essentially in what is beyond that little wall there. So to get to those customer outcomes, we need to focus on certain people outcomes. And so there are three types of people outcomes that I typically think of. We have task performance. That is when you have a job to do, do your people do that job well? So that could be in terms of performance ratings, it could be in terms of productivity, whatever measure you have. But there's a second piece there, and that's emotion performance. So specifically in service organizations, and I'm assuming most of you are working for service organizations because that's 85% of the economy, essentially service. And emotion performance essentially is the emotions that your employees in the front lines display to your customers. So when they are happy and they're satisfied with their own work and work conditions, they tend to create or infect their customers with happiness and satisfaction, things of that nature. So we track that as well. And then retention. So that's another third measure. So think of these as my three big go-tos. I always look at task performance, emotional performance, and retention. That is how many people, what percentage of the folks you've hired really stay with your organization. So the reverse of retention, as you well know, is turnover. And specifically within turnover, monitoring quits, right? So the idea, once again, so the research, once again, is very clear that these three indicators of people outcomes tend to have a strong relationship with these customer outcomes. So we have our own research, for instance, that have been able to demonstrate the fact that when you have higher retention rates, both voluntary and involuntary turnover tend to have negative effects, believe it or not, on customer outcomes, such as customer satisfaction, their perception of your brand, and things of that nature. Emotion performance, we actually have data out there that says that if customers perceive employees to be engaging with them positively and authentically, they tend to stay with the organization, they tend to have higher levels of loyalty and things of that nature. And the same with task performance as well. So that is the first place of interface, what I like to call the boundary. So what's happening with the employee behaviors is affecting what is happening with customers. And then what's happening with customers then translates into organizational outcomes. So what does HR have to do with this? Well, those people outcomes are emerging from certain specific processes that the organization has. And I'm going to be dividing them or putting them into three buckets. There are some human capital resources that your organization has to accumulate, and I'll talk about that in a second. The engagement processes that the organization has, and the organization's social architecture. So very quickly, what are these three things? So when you think of your talent, another way to think about your talent is in terms of the knowledge, skills, and traits that can be accessed by the organization. So a talent is not just somebody being good at something. Talent is about the knowledge, skills, and their personal qualities that can be accessed and used by the organization, accumulated by the organization, and turned into value, right? And we also know very clearly that as you keep on accumulating talent in terms of human capital resources, you also have this other process where you also start to see this leakage of talent. Let's use a bathtub metaphor. So think of taking a bath, right? So maybe this tonight, maybe Friday night, you'll go like, okay, I've done enough of my, it's been a crazy week. I'm going to sit down in my bathtub. So you turn on your faucet in your bathtub, and then you notice something really strange. Water is flowing into the bathtub, but flowing out too. And you go, why is that happening? Well, that's because of the stopper, silly. You didn't put the stopper in, and you didn't sort of screw it in tight enough. And that's the reason why all that water is escaping, right? So think of human capital resources or talent the same way. So when you think of, human capital resource processes, it's the attraction processes, right? The placement, socialization of people, but it is also all the processes that you have in place to make sure that the water doesn't escape, that it doesn't go out through the sinkhole, right? So the idea, once again, is that everything that you do from a talent attraction perspective, development perspective, training, and retention, those things matter. That's all this is saying. That's that one bucket. The second bucket is engagement. What kinds of things is your organization doing in terms of increasing employees' vigor, dedication, and absorption? What does that mean? Well, when we talk about engagement, a lot of times engagement surveys are really measuring satisfaction, which is fine. I have no problem with that. But then don't call them engagement surveys. Because really, when you think about engagement is about three things. First, it's about vigor. How much of energy do your employees bring to work? When they come in, do they shake the world around them, right? Second is dedication. And that has to do with the extent to which they feel loyal to the work that they're doing and the organization where they're doing it. And third is absorption. That is, how mindful and connected are they to work? If they are connected to that work, they also tend to be much better producers. They are less distracted, and that leads to high levels of ultimate outcomes, right? So what are the processes you have in place to create employee engagement? Our research essentially shows that there are at least two key drivers of employee engagement. There are several, but one of the drivers of employee engagement is psychological and physical safety. If your employees feel safe, they will be more vigorous, they'll be more dedicated, and they'll be more absorbed. That's number one. So all the work that we're doing in the DEI space, for instance, around inclusion, that really addresses the nature of psychological safety. Do I feel like I belong here? And do I feel like my uniqueness is appreciated here? That's the first driver, really, of engagement. The second driver of engagement that we have actually seen that seems to be there consistently across different studies is the job design. Imagine that, right? We don't think about that well enough. We take great people and we put them in lousy jobs. Can we make sure that the jobs are designed in ways that bring out the best capability of the employee? Training is great. Development is great. I absolutely am a big fan of training and development. I teach the darn thing. But the job design really matters. And that's what the research seems to show as well. Psychological safety, job design, these two are really big pieces. And the third part is social architecture, what you like to call culture and climate, right? So what are the shared values in this organization? What are the shared beliefs in this organization? Do you have certain rituals and patterns of behaviors that tend to enhance people's level of comfort and engagement and things of that nature? What are the shared perceptions of the people? One of the things that really happens in organizations is that we talk to each other. Imagine that, right? A lot of times leaders, when we set up processes, we don't think about the fact that employees actually talk to each other and they create a shared reality about what the organization looks like. And that shared reality starts becoming their actual reality. So that is really what social architecture is about. Social architecture is about not just the policies and procedures you have, but how are those policies and procedures perceived by employees? How do employees interact with each other to create this shared worldview? How are values and beliefs shared? So those are the three people processes, to kind of go back to the chain, that tend to influence task performance, emotion performance, and retention. So I'm going to stop for a second. I see, Rob, do you have a question?
Yeah, a couple of questions came in, one very specific to this, and you may get to this later, so let us know if you want to answer later. But it was, it says, not sure if you'll get into this later, but do you have any recommendations for how to convince chief executives about focusing on these inputs or the people outcomes for, customer outcomes and organizational outcomes?
No, that makes perfect sense. And tell you what, let's talk about the driver of these people processes, and I'll address this in a little more detail, and then we'll get back to it again when we talk about the craft, if that's okay.
Yeah, perfect.
So to get to these people processes, we need to have the right strategy, right? So I'm going to read this left to right in a second, but strategy drives everything. When I talk to executives, HR executives specifically, I always ask them this question: do you know how your company is creating value? Do you know how your organization is creating value? And the question of value is, believe it or not, the question of strategy. Strategy is not about strategic planning. Strategy is not about going on a retreat and sort of saying, here are the 17 things we're going to be doing over the year. Strategy is about knowing how your organization creates value and how you're going to allocate resources in order to create value. That's what strategy is. That's where I see most organizations making a mistake, right? So they sort of begin by assuming that everybody knows how they create value. So in order to get the people processes and people outcomes and the rest of it flowing, the first thing that you really need to do and focus on is the strategy. So to go back to that question that Rob just asked, your guest just asked, can you have a conversation with your CEO regarding what the organization's strategy is? How does our organization compete? And how is it that you plan to use the resources that we have and the resources that we wish to acquire? How do you plan to use it? I'm going to give you a very simplistic example here, please, and then we can make it more complicated if you like. Simplistic example. So we have a strategy. So a company, let's assume that we are, I use this all the time. So Walmart versus Whole Foods is kind of what I'm going to sort of work with here. And I don't know whether Whole Foods has any major imprint in Canada. Rob, I may just be way off here. But, oh yeah, it's there. Okay, good. So we have Walmart versus Whole Foods. Both are great. Both are on the top of their game. They just compete very differently, right? So Whole Foods tends to compete on the basis of its brand image, right? So the idea that the food that you buy at Whole Foods is going to be high quality, it's going to be not locally sourced, but organic and things of that nature. So that's there's a brand piece there. And customers of Whole Foods don't mind paying a few extra bucks for that piece, for that brand. Walmart tends to compete on the basis of speed, efficiency, and cost, right? These are two different strategies. Where are those strategies coming from? They're essentially coming from those specific organizations' conception of what value is and how value is created and for which customers, right? That conversation, if you have a conversation with the CEO and your CEO says, we'd like to compete on the basis of innovation. We would like to be an innovative organization. Aha, you got it. Now you can create your people processes, your HR, HCR, human capital resources, your engagement structures, and your social architecture around innovation. And now that will then translate into those kinds of behaviors and so on and so forth, right? Or they might just say, no, our focus essentially here is to make sure that our customers are satisfied and happy. Very good. Now your people processes can focus around, attracting, retaining, selecting people who are customer focused, developing them, creating high levels of engagement in your frontline employees, creating a social architecture where people have a shared conception of what customers want, expect, and so on and so forth. In other words, always latch what you're doing back to your strategy. Does that kind of help, Rob? I mean, if you were the guest, would they agree?
Yeah, I think I mean I would not disagree, and I think the crux of the question is like, how do we go about convincing executives of that? I guess making that connection, and whether that's data that you're going to get into, whether that's some other anecdotes. I think and I think we've all struggled in some capacity to try to have that alignment on focusing on the inputs of what people provide our business in terms of outputs. But I think any other color there would be helpful.
Okay, yeah, I will go ahead and talk about that also as we sort of unfold this. The second piece is leadership. The very fact that you have to convince your CEO that you need this kind of a framework or a measurement strategy kind of tells me that maybe there is a larger discussion that needs to be had in your organization about leadership itself. So what is it that the leader ought to be doing? What is your leader's role in your organization? So we've actually have seen maybe a couple dozen studies in which we looked at leaders who have a service focus, so who themselves have an interest in creating customer satisfaction, customer delight. And what really happens is those kinds of leaders not just create the right kind of processes that lead to customer satisfaction, but they also demonstrate the right values. And when they do that, people mimic it. People start doing the same things. Remember, what your leader will do, your senior leaders do, is what everybody else in the organization does. And we are seeing that consistently across all our different studies. The leadership behaviors really matter. Leaders sort of exemplify the behaviors that they not want to see, but they exemplify the behaviors that need to be seen, I guess. And the third piece is human resource management system. So once again, making sure that you have the right system to recruit, select, train, develop, and so on. And I won't get into specific best practices, but in general, we know that when we recruit, we need to we need to cast our net wide. When it comes down to selection, we need to make sure that we have sort of a multi-stage selection process, focus on sort of standardized kinds of items, measuring, scientifically validated constructs, and so on and so forth. I'm an IO psychologist. I have to drill that in to people all the time. From a training and development perspective, we know what really matters the most is action learning. So putting people into cross-functional teams, giving them an actual problem to solve, as opposed to putting them in classrooms and getting them to train that way. From a development perspective, it's important to have a succession planning program that doesn't just sort of stop at the senior levels, but sort of goes down as much as possible to junior management levels for sure. And so it's systematically adhered to, and so on and so forth. Oh, benefits, compensation, all that, right? So that's basically what this piece is. So now let's read left to right. If an organization has a clarity regarding its strategy, if it has leadership that exemplifies the strategy and the behaviors. Third, it has the right HR practices and systems that then translates into human capital resources, engagement, social architecture, which then translates into task performance, emotional performance, retention, which then translates into satisfaction, loyalty, and so on, which ultimately goes to the organizational outcomes. So this is the human capital value chain. Now, conceptually, that makes perfect sense to all of us, right? We're gonna say, yeah, I kind of read that sometime back in in a Harvard Business Review article. But the point I'm going to make here is you can actually create a measurement system around the human capital value chain. That is, you can come up with a way to measure each one of those pieces, and you can demonstrate how each one of those pieces connects with the other piece. Why is that? Because we have multiple studies out there. So I'm just going to show you one. There are about 6 like this, where we have found that the kind of social architecture that you create, in this case, it's called service climate, that is people's shared understanding of customer expectations. That tends to influence employee attitudes and service performance, which then translates into customer satisfaction and financial outcomes. And this is driven by HR practices and leadership. That's just one little study which consists of 58 independent studies. So this is called a meta-analysis. So what we do is we take multiple studies, put them in together, and just sort of say, here's what are all those studies really telling us? What's sort of the gist of it? 6 studies like this with different samples have actually shown us the same exact pattern. In other words, that the human capital value chain has some kind of quantitative and scientific validity. Now, just because you have a scientific validity doesn't mean that the human capital value chain is going to be accepted and understood and adopted within your organization. So how do you go about doing that? How do you go about convincing your organization that there is a need for a measurement system around the human capital value chain? I'll get into that in a second, but let me show you a quick illustration of how a chain like this can be used by your organization. So this comes from a study in which we measured competitive pay, that is employee perceptions of competitive pay in about 127 different units. And then what we found is, then we took those measures and then we statistically connected them with people processes, satisfaction, recommendation, loyalty. And then we connected that to customer satisfaction, labor productivity data. And by actually demonstrating, so what is the, I don't know how much you want to get into the measurement part in terms of the nuts and bolts, but really this is a regression-based strategy. So what you're doing is you're collecting data over time, and then you are running what are called cross-lag regressions. And those cross-lag regressions control for confounding and sort of noise variables, and they show what is the exact connection between the focal variables. And what we found in the study is that a 1 point increase, hang on, let me just move my slide a little bit. That a 1 point increase in engagement was related to a 5 point increase in customer satisfaction. So in general, at the unit level, if you saw a 1 point increase in employee satisfaction, that was actually related, employee satisfaction recommendation, so on, that was related to a 5 point increase in customer satisfaction. We also found that a 1 point increase in competitive pay perceptions was related to labor productivity, which is about $2,173 of revenue per employee. So again, I'm not saying that this is what you should be using, but this is kind of the conversation you can have with your organization. If you can actually show the fact that, if I invest in these kinds of human resource management practices, or if I can invest in these kinds of social architecture variables, then this is the amount of dollars that this organization can earn. For those who are not into dollars, I would say this is the value that can be created in terms of customer satisfaction. A customer satisfaction increase of 5% is a good idea. If you're a higher ed company, higher ed organization, like mine, showing an increase in, let's say, enrollment or an increase in retention of the enrolled students might be the measure that you might be after. So once again, the human capital value chain is not just a concept, it's also a way to think about measurement throughout the organization. And the idea here is that if you can tell a story around that measurement, you're more likely to be effective in getting folks to buy into the kinds of human resources or human capital initiatives you might have. I'm going to stop for a second. Rob, any questions so far?
Yeah, there's a few questions that kind of revolve around this, and your call if you want to kind of answer them now or dive into to them at the end. But one was pretty specific about what you talked about job design in that model. And and I'm interested in your answer as well. It was from Mark here for job design. Do you recommend the job characteristics model or something different? I'm not sure if you have any insights on that.
Yeah, the job characteristic model is the holy grail, right? So this is really, this was created by Hackman and Oldham in the late 1960s, early 1970s, and still it seems to hold pretty well. One piece that has been introduced in the job design model now is this idea of sort of the social architecture piece, right? So the interaction between employees tends to be also an important part of it. But one thing that we also need to keep in mind as we think of job design, especially in the sort of COVID, pre-COVID, sort of post-COVID, mid-COVID kind of an era, is the idea that a lot of folks are working remotely. So how does job design change given the fact that most of the teams that we are in right now are virtual teams? And what are the implications of this kind of virtual work for policies and procedures and how they translate into actual practices? So in other words, what does job enrichment look like given the fact that people are really working from home? A lot of people are working from home. And what does job enrichment look like for those people who are interacting with customers on a daily basis and they are going through this sort of worry and anxiety of being infected by COVID-19, for instance? So yeah, so the answer is yes, but with some major caveats.
Fair enough. And on the spirit and theme of how to tell the story, another really interesting question came in from Kevin saying, your thoughts on getting management to buy into the value of DEI, just because I know you brought that up earlier, and the need for it to be woven into a firm's strategy to create psychological and physical safety or to improve engagement and drive performance. So more just thoughts on getting management buy-in on the DEI perspective.
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. DEI is a particularly pertinent and important issue. So one of the questions that I ask folks in sort of a DEI context is, why is it that your organization is focusing on DEI? And if the answer is we are focusing on DEI because DEI has become really hot, this is important, I know that that organization is in deep trouble because they're essentially doing something because everybody else is doing it. They're sort of mimicking it, right? So one of the points that I always like to make is that approach DEI the way you would approach anything else when it comes down to human resources. So if you were to have a new compensation and benefits program that you were going to be launching into your organization, you will be focused on measurement, wouldn't you? You would be thinking of ROI. You would be thinking of the specific aspects of the compensation benefits program that needs to be tweaked and so on and so forth. You need to have the same level of sort of steely-eyed objectivity when it comes down to DEI within your organization as well. Because remember, DEI is not just about representation, although representation is really one of the big conditions. DEI is about culture. And it's easy to sort of say, yeah, we change our culture. Culture doesn't change that easily. I mean, I'm always reminded of, trees. Those old, trees that have been around for 2,000, 3,000 years, right? They also have roots, and those roots sort of go deep within, and those roots are intertwined with the roots of other trees, right? So when you think of the ecosystem that exists is not just what you see. The ecosystem is also what you don't see, what is underneath. That's the reason why culture is so difficult to change, because there is so much that happens underground that is connected and intertwined with other things. And the fact that there's a time element to it, which is why when we think of DEI and creating DEI interventions within organizations, we need high levels of leadership commitment. It cannot be simply mimicked or copied, and there needs to be a measurement system. And that measurement system has to be not just about representation, it also has to be about some kind of a culture of diversity and inclusion.
I'm smiling because the similar sentiment that you have when people come to WorkTango about we just want to do census, it's like, well, that's you need to think about the experiences and people's feelings around inclusion and equity and diversity within an organization. So I totally get it. And by the way, I love the analogy with the roots. I'm stealing that. I will note that you said it, but I think it's a fantastic way to think about it when it comes to changing culture in general.
Let me put a plug, now that you mentioned that, let me put a little plug in for an incredible science fiction book. It's called The Overstory. And it really talks about, it's an environmental, it's not a science fiction really, it's really about the environment and how what we see around us is shaped so much by sort of the living organisms that can't speak, specifically trees. So let me put that out there. Yeah.
Amazing. I'm going to put that in the chat right now. So there's a couple more questions, but I'm very interested in making sure we get to the craft part of this conversation, and we'll tackle the questions after, if that's okay with you, Mahesh.
Sure. So let me just give you an overview of the craft, and then I'll just go through a couple of ideas there, and then maybe at that point in time, we can detour to Q&A, and then, I'm willing to come back if you want me to continue that conversation.
Awesome. Thanks.
Perfect. So what is the craft of human capital value chain? So what is this measurement system? How do we create it? And so I like to think of this as a 10-step process divided into two categories: design and implementation. So there are certain things that you need to be doing within the organization from a design perspective. There are other things that you have to do from an implementation perspective. Let me kind of talk about design first, and let me see if I can get through some of this in the next 6 to 7 minutes. And then we can talk about implementation at a future date, or we can, email me. I mean, I'm available to talk to you guys. So if you're really interested in creating a human capital value chain within your organization, in other words, you want to really show the relationship between the kinds of things that you're doing from a human resources and human capital perspective and how that translates into actual organizational outcomes, you need to begin with identifying need. And as I mentioned earlier, business strategy is a great place to start, right? How does your organization create value? What are the people-related drivers of strategy? Those conversations have to happen at not just a high level, but they need to happen at a very deep level. In other words, not just the fact that, hey, we like to compete by having, by making our customers happy, but kind of how, making customers happy, how? By giving stuff away for free? Or is it by making sure that you have better design characteristics? What is it that you do, and how do we do that? That conversation, when that conversation happens, you can start bringing the people element into that conversation. So yeah, we'd like to create great designs so that the customers are inspired and they would like to buy our product or service. Who creates that design? Well, designs are created by folks in these kinds of roles. Oh, that means we need these kinds of people in those roles, people with these, human capital characteristics. Oh, I see. All right. And how do those people interact with each other? If you have those kinds of conversations early on in the process, you're able to start, pinpointing the specific characteristics of human capital resources, engagement, and social architecture. And if you are able to bring those kinds of conversations, and they become as important within the C-suite as conversations about the next merger acquisition or cost cutting or whatever it might be, things would really look good. The second is diagnosing appetite. It's good for us to think that we want a great measurement system, but does your organization want a great measurement system? You need to have a pretty good sense of what matters to employees and managers and customers and different functions and businesses. Is this something that you want? Because if you are going to be creating a system like this, you will need to draw data from your HR function, but you need to draw data from your operations, from marketing, and so on and so forth as well. Is everybody on board? Is everybody willing to play? Are there certain stores? Are there certain establishments? Are there certain parts of our organization that are willing to give some data, and other parts? If there are other parts that are not willing to play, then you might not succeed, because you actually need to have as much of representation as possible across the organization. Second, what else is going on in the organization? So DEI is a big thing, like we talked about. Is it possible for you to take your human capital value measurement plan and connect it somehow to your DEI plan? So you can sort of say, in order to create inclusion, we need to measure how people engage with each other, how do they engage with the customer, and we need to measure that. And if we are able to measure that, we would be able to now prove that the DEI interventions are having some sort of an effect on employee morale, engagement, and also customer satisfaction, loyalty. If that's the tack that's going to work for you, then that's a track you want to try. If your organization is into lean, for instance, you might actually have a conversation regarding, how your human capital value system is connected to lean management, right? So in order to have lean, you need to have empowered employees. So we need to measure employee empowerment and employees' satisfaction with their empowerment levels. And then we need to connect it to quality and cost indicators. Yeah, that makes sense. Okay, good. So that's how your measurement system is going to be sold, so to speak. Do we have possible sponsors? And it's very clear, I'm going to just say this, HR and non-HR. It's not or. You're somebody from human resources and somebody from the functions, the line, need to be sort of together in order to sponsor this kind of initiative. You next have to develop a theory. And what does a good theory mean? And I will show you a very quick example. This is called a strategy map. And a strategy map is a really good way of building your theory of how your organization creates value. So this is a strategy map of Patagonia. So Patagonia really, as you all know, it's an outdoor wear company, and they are really committed to environmental causes. So they want to improve profitability, grow revenue, increase market share. But how? They want to do that by providing, extreme gear. They want to protect the clients, and they want to fight for the community, right? In order to do that, what do they need to do in terms of internal processes? They need to improve efficiency, solve their own problems, inspire innovation, and so on and so forth. In order to do that, what kinds of people processes do they need? Well, they need to create lifetime employees. They want to make sure the employees stay with them forever, are retained, and because they also already do a fantastic job of selecting employees. They just need to make they stay. You want to create a culture, and you want to make sure that the culture is maintained over time. You need to enable technology. So that is their strategy map. And once you create a strategy map like this together as a group, you now know what are the key pieces of the human capital value chain and how those pieces can be measured. Because now you need to have some measure around creating lifetime employees. So retention, for instance. Around culture, you might have a culture survey. Around technology, you might actually look at how technology is adopted within the organization. Then you need to identify your resources. Who will champion this project, who will execute, and so on and so forth. And then demonstrate and develop an empirical model. And at this point in time, I'm going to stop, because this is where it actually starts getting technical, where you need to start thinking about what kinds of causal models are you going to be using in your research. The term that we use for that is predictive analytics, right? So what is your predictive analytics model? And how is that model created? How is it designed? And how can it be practical? So I'm not going to go any more deeper into this at this point in time, Rob, because I know we only have 7 more minutes. So I'm going to stop for a second, and I would like to take as many questions as I possibly can.
Yeah, no, appreciate it. Yeah, we could probably spend another hour talking about the analytics component, and I do agree, not a lot of time to dive in. There's 2 kind of questions I thought might be interesting to everyone. One on the Q&A was, it kind of gets back to the DEI component. But there's a common thought that the DEI space, that, in quote, we cannot use the master's tools to achieve change because it's these same tools that brought us to this inequity in the first place. So how do you use the same tools?
I think that's a fantastic question. I would urge the questioner to question themselves and find out how is it that the tools were responsible for the status quo. Were the tools that created the status quo, or was it the use of those tools by specific people within the organization that created the status quo? So let's take a tool within the DEI space, and that might be, I'll talk about 2 different tools. One tool is simply measurement, right? Survey tools. The second kind of tool is tools around incentives. So providing incentives to the organization for targeted hiring and things of that nature. So if you're thinking of those tools, think about why your organization adopted those tools and what went wrong. Is it the tool that needs to be thrown out, or should we be thinking a little differently about how those tools were created and became part of the organization's culture? Yeah, that would be my simple answer to it. In other words, reflect, introspect, figure out what is the real problem here.
Yeah. They re-commented and said, that's exactly my point. No matter what is done, it still means people are involved and their own biases may still be present.
Yeah, and those biases will never go away. May I just say this? I mean, I might sound strange and crazy, but we've had these biases as human beings for the last 300,000 years. And those biases are going to continue, right? The thing we can actually do is to some extent manage those biases. I'm speaking as an IO psychologist here. I know that there are certain basic policies and procedures that we can create within the organization, as well as actual conversations, authentic conversations that can really help. At least uncover some of these biases and have a discussion around those biases. But unless we are having those authentic conversations, nothing is going to change. We haven't changed in so many like I said, hundreds of thousands of years. Yeah.
I always say the technology or the tools, those are the enablers, right? But at the end of the day, it's not going to solve all the issues and the problems.
Yeah.
One question I find it really curious as well in your answer, because I sit on an advisory board at a university in Canada, and it says from Steve, I'm currently completing an executive MBA, like many top business schools. let's say like Oxford doesn't include HR as a core topic or even an elective. And do you have any view to why this might be and what it says about the standing of the HR function and whether it should be included in MBA curricula? So I know we're getting really specific to education, and I'm very curious in your thoughts as well. So I appreciate that question.
So let me just say this: my school, where I have taught for a while, does not have an HR course in the MBA curriculum either, but we have an organizational behavior course. We have a change management course now that is mandatory for all our MBA students. We also have a third course that is an elective, that's leadership. So in other words, that we are focusing on various aspects of the human value or human capital value piece through other routes. One of the reasons is the moment you say human resources, you start thinking of the function, HR function. And most folks say, well, I'm not part of the HR function. But if you think of human resources as the actual task of any manager, then things change. That's where there's been this sort of effort to repackage it. And some folks call it human capital resources, for instance, now. But I also like to say that a lot of these concepts of benefits and compensation and training and development and things of that nature can be really sort of infused or built into your other behavioral science kinds of courses that you might be offering.
Awesome. I guess the kind of last question was, where do you start? Like, let's say we're on this session, kind of trying to tackle this for the first time in our team or organization. Like, any recommendations on what's the right mindset to start with, or even approach to kind of make this process a reality?
Yeah, I think the first question to ask is, do you want a measurement system that measures everything from the beginning to the end? And if so, why do you want it? What benefits do you think that will accrue? And is there an appetite within the organization for a system like that? If there is not an appetite for an entire sort of human capital value chain, is there at least appetite for a specific aspect of it? So for instance, is there an appetite for measuring retention or measuring the quality of folks you're hiring? And if so, can you sort of get into that in greater detail, demonstrate value through that, and then try to get buy-in from the rest of the managers to sort of expand the scope of your operation?
Got it. So that kind of closes out everyone else's questions. I might add one, and we were actually talking about it before the webinar started, but there might be some folks here that are part of large organizations. Some are part of smaller ones. And, do you think there's still validity and necessity to go through the rigor of doing this even in a small organization, and any other kind of ideas or thoughts around how they would approach it?
I'm just going to give you a very simple answer to that. I have a friend who runs a small company of 10 people, IT consulting out of a place in Michigan. And somebody asked him this question, really, a manager from a medium-sized organization asked him this, and he said, why should we have a measurement system? Specifically, he had a 360-degree feedback system for all his employees, and he has an employee engagement survey. And they asked him, you got 10 people. Why do you need to do this? And he says, because culture matters. And the other person said, well, culture matters to us too. And he says, no, it matters a lot to me. One person who goes rogue can destroy the entire culture of my organization. So I need to make sure that I'm developing everybody at all points in time, and I'm constantly taking the pulse of people. And therefore, these HR systems are actually needed more in small companies and medium-sized organizations than they are in large companies.
Love it. I always get asked, who's your customer, the profile of your customer, and I always say companies that care. So
companies that care.
It doesn't really matter the size or type.
I love that answer. Yeah.
So with that all being said, we're just at the top of the hour. I wanted to just do a big thank you, Mahesh, for joining, sharing that knowledge. I know it's a huge topic, but I think you did a really good job kind of helping us wrap our head around what it can mean for organizations. So thank you for your time. Really appreciate it. And I appreciate everyone for joining today and being interactive and sharing their questions, and hopefully found a lot of value in that. I wish everyone a wonderful rest of the week and holiday season. Look forward to seeing this community back together next year. Crazy that next year is only 3 weeks away, but have a fantastic rest of the day, everyone. Take care.
Thank you.